All right, we've covered some memory ideas. Hopefully you can apply it to this section. This section is all about the history and the approaches of psychology. We're going to look at some of the historical approaches, where it started way back in 1879 with like crude instruments, like the one I'm showing you back there. And we're also going to look at some of the more modern research areas and where do psychologists work. This is a section that is tested on the AP exam, so make sure you apply the memory concepts that will help you remember things along the way. And we're going to get started right now with psychology's history and approaches. All right, we're moving on to psychology's history and perspectives. Take a pause and look at the learning objectives and see what you're trying to get out of this so that you know exactly what it is you're looking for here. Okay, so moving into this, since people have been on Earth, people have been wondering, how does the mind and body communicate? How do we know what we know? Are we born knowing what we know, or do we actually learn it? And these are questions that people have had since the beginning of time, and that's probably one of the reasons why psychology is so interesting. Is we do have some answers, but most of it has been answered in the last very brief period of time as far as history goes. But all the way back into Buddha's time in India, he wondered how sensations and perceptions combined to form ideas. Confucius in China, 551 to 479 BC, he stressed the power of ideas and the importance of an educated mind. I'm sure you've heard of some of the Confucius sayings. The Hebrew scriptures, even way back then, they linked the mind and emotion to the body, which is kind of a precursor to what psychology is today. Some of the guys you may have heard about is Socrates and Plato. Socrates was a very famous teacher and philosopher, and Plato was one of his students. They came to believe, really based on logic, that the mind was separate from the body. So when the body dies, the mind lives on. It continues to exist after death. So ideas were actually innate. You were born with all the ideas that you're going to have. Aristotle, a student of Plato, suggested that the soul is not separable from the body, and that knowledge grows from experience. Aristotle believed in data. He looked at things. He had many conclusions that he came up with. Of course, some of them are wrong, but he did not have the breadth of education that you folks have today. René Descartes, a Frenchman, he was like Plato. He believed that the soul and body separation. But he wondered how the immaterial mind and physical body communicated. And when he looked at things, he would look at animals and he would notice the nerves, and he thought they were hollow things and there were fluid-filled sacs in your brain. So he thought it was the animal spirits that ran through your system and is how your mind and body communicated. Good try, not quite there. Francis Bacon is very significant, though. He's really known as one of the founders of the modern science, especially the experimental method. That's kind of his biggest contribution. And when we combine it with the ideas of John Locke, Locke held that the mind was a tabula rasa, or a blank sheet to be at birth, and experience need to be written on it. He spent 20 years writing a paper that actually became influential and became a big part of how we conduct science today. So historically, if we look at mind and body are connected, the people that are monoists, the groups, the Hebrews believe we're monoists. Aristotle believed that, and Augustine believed that. The dualists that thought the mind and body are distinct are Socrates, Plato, and Descartes. How ideas are formed, whether they're learned or whether you're born with them, Socrates and Plato were on the idea that all of our ideas are innate. We're born with them. On the other side, that experience shapes us, was Aristotle and John Locke, coming up with the term tabula rasa. So empiricism is kind of born. Empiricism is the idea that we gain from experimentation and careful observation. psychology is a science. It's a new science compared to like chemistry or biology and all those things which are, a couple thousand years old. Ours started in 1879, where the first psychological experiment actually occurred. And Wilhelm Wundt, that's a fun name to say. Try it, Wilhelm Wundt, in the University of Leipzig. All he did was set up a contraption, which is what I showed you in the introduction to this video, that would measure the reaction of a person when a ball dropped to the time they hit a telegraph key. So this was the first actual scientific experiments, which moves psychology really from being more of a philosophy into a science. G. Stanley Hall was a student of Wundt's, and he actually set up the first laboratory in the United States at Johns Hopkins University. One of the assistants of and students of Wundt was Edward Titchener. And he started the school of thought. When we talk about schools of thought, these are philosophies, things that they have common in their knowledge of how they put together ideas. He came up with a thing called structuralism, where they tried to look at the structures of the mind. So much like a chemist would depend on a periodic table, this is what Titchener set out to do in Wundt. They're called structuralists because these are the structures of the mind. They believe that, we know, there's one thing we know a lot about, and that is ourselves. So he used a process called introspection. Now, introspection was somebody's initial responses to experience. These all had to be objective responses. You couldn't have qualitative things. So if I gave you a chocolate, for example, you couldn't say, this is good. As far as an introspective perspective, you'd have to say, well, it's creamy, it's smooth, it's bitter. All of them have to be objective kind of thoughts. William James actually worked with Charles Darwin. He was a big fan of Charles Darwin. And he looked at, the structures are great, but really how do they work in the real world? So he looked at the functions of your mind and the functions of our behaviors. So his school of thought is called Functionalism. William James is known for a few things. He was quite a character, apparently, back in the day. I never met him. One of the things that he did do, though, was at Harvard University, one of the first females that actually enrolled in one of his courses. At this time, women couldn't vote. Women were discriminated against. They were considered to be lesser. And, of course, girls, we know better than that now. But when she enrolled in this class, that all of the male students dropped out. William James said, okay, go ahead and drop out. I'm going to tutor Mary Calkins. And as it turned out, in the exit exam, she scored higher than any other student at the time, easily a doctoral candidate. However, the university, Harvard University, would not give her the degree. Instead, they gave her an equivalent to a bachelor's degree instead of a doctorate from one of their women's universities. Margaret Floyd Washburn holds the distinction of being the first woman to be granted a PhD in psychology. Nowadays, look how things have changed, where we're looking at like 2/3 of graduates in psychology are actually female. And I think you'll see in my experience, most of my classes, and I assume this year, that majority of the students are female. So with experimental psychology, she still wouldn't be allowed into the school of experimental psychology. So there's still a lot of discrimination. Incidentally, Mary Calkins pressed on. She became the first president of the American Psychological Association, which is the largest psychological association in the world. And Margaret Floyd Washburn actually became the second woman. So good on them. So a guy you might have heard about, it's kind of well known, Sigmund Freud. Freud has all kinds of strange ideas, but his school of psychology is called psychoanalytic. Now, psychoanalytics is the whole idea that unconscious thoughts drive your behaviors. So things you're not even aware of. And we will definitely be looking a little bit more at Mr. Freud in future chapters, including the personality chapter. He had some pretty interesting ideas, mostly how personality was developed through sexual erogenous zones from the time you were born. It gets pretty weird, I know. Behaviorism is a school where they actually believe that, if we're going to be a science, if psychology is a science, we should probably only deal with observable things. So that's what behaviorism is looking at observable behaviors. John B. Watson is a big person in this. The picture down at the left there is an excerpt from a Little Albert experiment, which is a very famous experiment, which you'll hear about. Rosalie Rayner was his assistant. He ended up having an affair with her, which actually had him removed from his position. We'll learn a lot more about John Watson and his interesting life in class. Another big player in behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. Huge contributor, very well known, very famous man. He believed that observable behavior was the only way a science should be approached. Conditioning is something that he looked at. He's famous for conditioning pigeons and rats to do things that you wouldn't expect them to be able to do. And we will learn a lot more about them when we do our learning chapter, and it's quite interesting concepts. Another school of thought is the humanistic psychologists. Humanistic psychologists kind of believe in the good of people. They believe that given the right circumstances, we will become what they would call self-actualized, and which means we would be the best that we can be. And often there are barriers in the way, and they would try to figure out the barriers and remove them. The big players in this one are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Carl Rogers, you can remember him because remember Mr. Rogers, the TV guy? He was a good guy. And humanists are kind of the good guys of psychology. Maslow is known for his Maslow hierarchy of needs, which you will learn more about later on. Cognitive neuroscience has been brought into the mix as looking at the actual biological issues that happen in your brain in the process of learning. So that's another branch kind of led from the humanistic. Another big one from the humanistic is positive psychology, which is definitely grown from humanistic psychology.